Right. Can you tell what this shirt is? It's the Solid logo. It's a very old shirt. Um, I don't think that there's anyone on the web today who can say that things are really working out. Between the advertising hell that you see and sites that are owned by crazy billionaires, it's safe to say that this isn't the kind of web that really anyone wanted. It always feels like you're giving away your own data for someone else to benefit, and you don't really get to enjoy your data just for yourself. So there's no shortage of platforms that let you take back your own data, but building those platforms is complex. It requires money and labor. And that's just building the platform. You also need money and labor to build use cases that use that platform. How do you get that money for labor? Well, you need a business model that makes sense. For a lot of platforms, business model is crypto. I'm not a huge fan of this for reasons I won't go completely into, but long story short, it's just asset speculation. It's not something that is providing a true benefit to the user. Don't get me wrong, there's some really cool projects out there that use crypto to fund them, but the main reason why people are buying the crypto is because they think that it is going to accrue in value, not as much because they think that the technology is actually worth something. But this video isn't about crypto, it's about Solid. I feel like every video I make needs to have a little section explaining what Solid is. You know how when you have a file on your computer, like let's say a TXT file, it just gets saved to your hard drive and now you can open that with anything. You could open it with VS Code or Notepad or any other kind of file that could edit a TXT. Solid is like that, but on a web scale. So you could save your chat file to a personal online data store, and now any kind of chat app can access that file from any device. And your friends can access that file using the chat app of their choice. It's got an access control and identity system so that you can control who has access to your file. So this is all good, but you might be noticing that unlike the crypto projects, there's not a built-in way to generate funds to fund the labor of actually building Solid use cases. So that's what this video is about. This is 10 business models for Solid. Number 1, social media apps. This one's probably the first thing people think of when they think, I want to build something on Solid. In fact, fun fact, Solid used to actually be an acronym for Socially Linked Data. It was spelled like this with capitals and lower cases. It looked like a ransom note. But the point is that it was initially conceived as a replacement for things like Facebook and Twitter before its scope expanded to being a replacement for kind of everything on the web. The use case is compelling. Who doesn't want to get off of Facebook and Twitter? It would be so great to be able to own your own social media posts just on your personal online data store without having to deal with all of those big companies and their server hosting and their advertising and all of that stuff. But despite it being a kind of compelling, obvious use case, this business model has some real problems with it, at least today. One of the big expectations people have when you hear take your data back from big social media companies is that they'll be able to live out their current social media life just on a different platform. This requires keeping the same friends and being able to post and share it with the friends even if they haven't adopted Solid themselves. And that requires interacting with the Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook APIs. APIs that are owned by your competitor. And they have complete control over it. And with that complete control over these APIs, they can completely destroy any business model that you've set up. In fact, we've seen this before. When Microsoft bought LinkedIn, they shut down a ton of capabilities of the LinkedIn API, and it killed entire companies. This is all just to say that if you are to build a replacement for social media on top of Solid, your target demographic needs to be people who are completely devoted to the idea of data ownership. Which does limit your demographic, but it's not impossible. There are tons of very privacy-minded people out there who would appreciate great social media built on top of Solid. Whatever demographic you choose for this business case, it needs to be people who are willing to pay upfront for social media. Because we all know how regular social media is funded, it's advertising. And the entire point of a Solid social media app is to get away from the hellscape that is advertisers owning all of your data. Or is it? Is there an ad tech solution that works with Solid's philosophy? Am I about to transition to business model number 2? Number 2, data collectives. I've heard a lot of people in the Solid community say that they don't necessarily hate the idea of online advertising. They just hate the fact that it's these big advertising conglomerates that own all their data and are profiting from their information. But if I, the user, could sell my data to advertisers and get a little bit of that sweet cash, then maybe I'd be fine with it. This does have problems with scale. Imagine if I just went to the advertiser and said, hey, Mr. Advertiser, I've got some data on me. Do you want it? And then Mr. Advertiser would say, what, it's just you? It's just data about you? Why are you wasting my time? I need to talk to thousands of people before this actually benefits me. First of all, rude, Mr. Advertiser, but he does have a point. And that's where the data collective comes in. Think of it like a union that can do collective bargaining on your data. The business would go to the advertiser and say, hey, we've got private data on thousands of people that have each consented to give you, Mr. Advertiser, that data for targeted ads. All you need to do, Mr. Advertiser, is fork over some money to our users, and now you've got that sweet data. The concept is a bit easier to talk about than implement. Of course, it's incumbent on you, the business owner, to find advertising companies that are willing to go along with this scheme. And also it is incumbent on you, the business owner, to find ways to generate data to put into people's pod that would be interesting to advertisers. And then also find users who want to make some money from that data. But those are all business problems. Solid is perfectly able to handle this from a technical side, as long as people have personal online data stores to store their data. Which brings us to the next big category of ideas. The next couple of ideas are going to be about this category, which is pod hosting. That transition sounded a little bit like Purd from Parks and Rec.
Issue number one is the first issue we're going to talk about.
Anyway, someone's got to host the pod. That takes electricity, takes hardware, takes maintenance costs to do. So who is paying for all of that? Number 3, government pods. If we think about what a solid pod is, it's a data storage device that's pretty agnostic to the kind of data that's on it. It's kind of analogous to like your power company. There might be a bunch of different power plants generating electricity, but it's all the same kind of electricity. And it's all going to your house. So why can't we treat solid pods as a data utility as well? What if a government said, as a service to its citizens, we are going to provide taxpayer-funded pod hosting? That might sound a little far-fetched for people like us Americans who are just used to our government not doing anything for its citizens, but it's happening right now in other countries. In Flanders, which is the northernmost part of Belgium, there's a data utility called Athumi that is using solid pods to store citizen data. And this has caused a whole ecosystem of companies in Flanders to crop up to serve Athumi. Maybe you could do the same in your country. Especially in Europe, there's a lot of governments that care about protecting their citizens' data from those evil American big tech companies. If you're familiar with any local politicians, give it a try, give it a pitch. Tell them, hey, maybe we could be the next Athumi. Maybe my German village or my French province. Does France have provinces?
France is divided into 18 administrative regions.
Administrative region.
The 13 metropolitan regions include 12 mainland regions and Corsica.
Maybe if you're from Corsica, convince your Corsica government to have a government-hosted pod. Anyway, the strategy here is to start small. Think of something your government needs, like keeping your address on file. Go to your local representative. Tell them about how Flanders was able to implement something with Solid, so maybe you could implement something too. And who knows, maybe someday your region of the world will be considered the thought leader that brought Solid into the mainstream. And it all started with you choosing to help them host some Solid pods. Number 4, consumer pod hardware. One of the good things about the business model of pod hosting infrastructure is you don't require as much software development work. There's already both open source and closed source pod hosting available that you can just use. You just need to get it to the user somehow. And the most obvious way to get it to the user is by giving them a physical machine that they can put in their house. This business model would really appeal to the more privacy-minded individuals who don't want to trust a cloud provider to host all of their personal data. Now, it's true that today, anyone can just download one of the open source solid pod providers and put it on a computer that they own. I personally have my old MacBook sitting next to my router right now, and that's serving as my personal solid pod. But that is a bit of a hassle to set up. Wouldn't it be awesome if you could just order a solid pod, plug it into your Ethernet cable, and then you're good to go? The business model here is relatively obvious. A user is paying for the convenience of setting up a solid pod and is also paying for the hardware of the device that they're storing their data on. There is one problem from a convenience perspective though, and that is port forwarding. If we are plugging the solid pod into a standard router, it needs to be able to communicate with the rest of the internet. By default, a router isn't going to expose a random device to the open internet. You need to go into the router's configuration and set up port forwarding, which will let devices make requests directly to that pod. And that sounds inconvenient. So here's a thought if you want to go down that hardware path. What if you made a router? Like you made a router pod combo, and now you just plug that into your modem and everything magically works. Of course, this hardware-centric approach is not for the faint of heart. You need to be sure that you're keeping things secure for your customers and all the firmware is properly handled. But if you're looking for the easiest way for people to really own their own data in their house, this might be the answer. Number 5, consumer pod cloud hosting. On the other hand, there will be tons of people who don't want to host their pod at their house and just want some company that's an expert in the field to host it at a certified cloud center for them. And that's completely fine. We can accommodate that. The business model is simple. Much like Dropbox or Google Drive, a user would pay to have a certain amount of data on a Solid pod that they can use with any of the Solid applications that they want. And that could be it for this section. Simple business model. We'll move on to the next one. You just get people to pay for your cloud hosting service. But I have a few other thoughts on this. First of all, this is something that I think we really need in the Solid ecosystem. You see, there are a bunch of cloud pod providers out there right now, but they're mostly used for experimentation. There's very few consumer-focused pod providers that are actually fully production ready. Kitty. So if you do decide to do this business model, you would be helping the entire ecosystem. And you could start out with a kind of freemium price plan where you get a certain amount of data for free, and then if you want to expand the amount of data that you're storing, then you charge for it. But our goal is to eventually get everyone onto Solid. And I gotta say, not everyone is paying for Google Drive or Dropbox. So how do we expand this business model to be something that everyone is willing to pay for? So maybe eventually in the future, what you can do is bundle this subscription with something that people are already used to paying. Things like an internet service provider or a mobile bill. Imagine a world where it becomes common for users to get pod hosting along with the things that they're already used to paying for. That would be how you get mass adoption of Solid. Number 6, certification compliant pod. I used to intern at a company called Area 1 Security. We did phishing security, so to protect against phishing attacks. At the time, Area 1's claim to fame is that it was the only company that had a no-phish guarantee. How do you ensure that your customers will never get phished? Is it perhaps because the company is more technically adept than anything else in the history of mankind? Is it impervious to hackers? Well, no, any company that says that it's impervious to hackers is lying to you. You should not trust them. While at Area 1, I learned a lot about how the business of the cybersecurity world actually works. You see, unlike what I previously believed, the main job of a chief security officer, or CSO, is not to make sure that the company is technically impervious to hacks. It's actually all just insurance. A CSO's job is to be sure that the company is insured against the possibility of hacks. That's how you can get chief security officers like the one at Equifax who didn't have a degree in anything technical. She had like a degree in music from the University of Georgia. But knowing this is how chief security officers think, we can use that for a business model on Solid. So what Area 1 Security did is they just had great insurance in case one of their customers actually succumbs to a phishing attack. That way, the liability is on Area 1 Security and not the customer. CSOs love this. If they can offload liability to someone else, then that's less on their plate. So knowing this is how CSOs think, we can apply the same concept to a Solid pod. If you make a Solid pod provider that has all of the right certifications, I'm talking ISO 27001, HIPAA, everything under the sun, and then you go to various companies and say, hey, we're going to host your data for you. If there's a hack, it's on us. Our insurance is covering it. Throw in a few thoughts about GDPR compliance and customers being able to have access to their personal data at any time, and you've just made a sale. The company is happy because they don't need to worry as much about security compliance, and the users are happy because their data has now been transferred into a Solid ecosystem where you get all of the interoperability benefits of Solid. And with that, I think that we've completely transitioned into the business zone.
Business zone.
Business zone! Pew pew! Companies have money, and a successful Solid ecosystem will see products for both companies and consumers. You just need to find the industries where interoperability and data sharing are needed. Number 7, the construction industry. There are so many different parties involved in the construction industry. You have architects, structural engineers, electricians, HVAC people. A ton of people need to come together to build a building. And from their perspective, a building is different things. While an HVAC person might not care about everything that the structural engineer cares about, there is overlap. You can't take out a load-bearing pillar to put in an air duct. So all of this data is shared between people, but you could imagine a bunch of different applications used to access this data. That's where the interoperability of Solid comes in handy. Imagine if the structural engineer puts their structural engineering data on one pod, but it links to another pod that is owned by the HVAC engineer. And all of this data forms a web of data that represents the entire building. Solid can enforce access control for all the different parties involved so that only the right contractors are getting access to the correct data. There's actually already a company doing this use case. It's called Graphmetrics, and they've got a TrinPod platform that if you're in the construction industry, you can try out. Fair warning, TrinPods is not 100% compatible with the Solid specification, but it's pretty close. Number 8. Medical records. So medical records are a mess. They're very siloed for really no good reason. They're these big siloed databases called EHRs, or electronic health records, things like Epic systems. And they're all sold to individual hospitals and healthcare clinics. What this essentially means is that each person's healthcare record can be split up between a bunch of different healthcare providers. This actually has caused problems in the past. Like, there's an example of someone who had chronic asthma and had to visit a ton of different healthcare providers in the UK. They didn't share the same medical records, and at one point, they went to a healthcare provider and they were prescribed the wrong medication. This eventually led to a death that could have been avoided if the healthcare records were unified. Under Solid, people can store their healthcare data on their individual Solid pods, and then bring that healthcare data with them as they go to different medical providers. This is a use case that's a little bit hard to sell to an individual medical organization like a hospital, because you really don't garner any benefit from it unless there's a bunch of different hospitals and a bunch of different clinics involved in the ecosystem. So it's no wonder that this use case was initially tried with the National Health Service, a nationalized healthcare system that has thousands of hospitals and medical providers involved in its ecosystem. Number 9, supply chain. If we're talking about a bunch of organizations working together, then there's probably nothing more interconnected than a supply chain. But supply chains also have some big siloing problems that Solid can be the solution to. For example, one project that I worked with in the past is around carbon tracking. Now, it's relatively easy for a company to understand how much carbon they emit and how much electricity they use. But if we're going to track how much carbon it takes to bring a product to market, then you also need to know how much carbon it took to produce all of the supplies that went into that product. And that's relatively hard for manufacturers to do. The databases of most manufacturers are siloed. It might contain some information about their suppliers, but probably not a lot of information about things down the supply chain. But doing something like carbon tracking requires information from everything. But the more entities in the supply chain that are tracking their data on Solid, the easier it is to get that information. It turns what used to be an engineering problem, where you would need to build massive pipelines between everyone, into just a business problem. Ask for permission for that data, and then the permission can be granted and sent over. And needless to say, this goes beyond carbon tracking. Imagine the massive kerfuffle that was the supply chain ecosystem in COVID. Companies didn't have contingency plans for the supply chain disruptions that were coming. But if you're able to see information from all the way down in the supply chain, then you can start to adapt your business to be able to handle that. And manufacturers will pay for that kind of insight. It's just your job to build the tools on top of Solid that can handle that. And finally, number 10, digital credentials wallet. So there are these things called verifiable credentials. They're basically just little files that have been signed by some authority. So imagine like your driver's license. It has some information. It has your age, your birthday, maybe ethnicity, your address in it. And all of this information is signed by a government that says all of these things are correct. Person A was born at this date. You can take that verifiable credential, give it to another party, and then they can validate that all of the data in that verifiable credential is true, at least according to the claims of whatever government or authoritative entity signed it. The standard example of this is that the government has issued a verifiable credential for my birthday. I give it to someone at a bar and they verify that I am over the drinking age, and they are okay with me coming into the bar because the government says I am over the drinking age. It's more secure than just a regular driver's license because it's very difficult to forge. The verifiable credential standard is used in a bunch of different places, but what the standard doesn't say is exactly where those verifiable credentials should be stored. And there's actually a pretty good case to say SolidPod should be where you store your verifiable credentials. Let's look at some alternatives and see how SolidPod stack up to those. One is that you could store your verifiable credentials on your phone, but the problem with this is that now your phone needs to be online whenever you want to present a verifiable credential. What if I'm asleep and my bank is running an automated process that they need to verify my identity? They shouldn't need to wait until I wake up to present that verifiable credential to them if I've already shared it with them. Conversely, a SolidPod is connected to the internet and is always online, so as long as you've shared the credential with the bank or whatever entity, they'll have access to it. Another alternative is storing it on a blockchain, but that's essentially saying that your verifiable credential is going to be public information. And there's a lot of information, like especially medical information, that might require a verifiable credential that you wouldn't want to be public. So as long as you build a fantastic user experience for requesting and issuing verifiable credentials, a SolidPod is one of the best places you could be storing these. And that's 10 ideas. Keep in mind, these are just ideas though, and as the advice usually goes, ideas are worth nothing. It's all about implementation. You might have noticed that a lot of things that I've talked about requires a good relationship with local politicians or knowledge of the medical industry or construction industry or whatever industry. That's where business comes into play. Solid is a technology. It's a tool to accomplish problems. But it's the job of the business owner to be the connective glue that connects the technology to the problem that it's solving. But if you're the kind of person who can forge those business connections, then you're needed in the ecosystem, and we'd love to have you. Hey, thanks so much for watching. This video is very selfishly sponsored by me. If any of the ideas that you saw sound good to you, or if you have any other ideas on what to implement on Solid, I do run a small consulting service called O.Team, and we can implement any solution on Solid that you want. So go to our website at O.Team, link in the description below, and I'll see you there. No, we love you. But you've got to not disrupt my filming. We love you.